in the year 1584. As the Protestant Reformation continued to fracture the unity of Christian Europe, and the Ottoman Empire pressed against the eastern borders of Christendom, a child was born who would one day command the largest empire the world had ever known. Margaret of Austria entered the world in the castle of Graz, nestled in the alpine foothills of what is now Slovenia, as the daughter of Archduke Charles II of Austria and Maria Anna of Bavaria. Her birth represented not merely the arrival of another Habsburg princess, but the continuation of a dynasty that had spent centuries weaving an intricate web of marriage alliances, territorial acquisitions, and political maneuvering that stretched from the windswept coasts of Spain to the gold, rich colonies of the Americas and the spice-laden ports of the Philippines. The castle where Margaret drew her first breath stood as a testament to Habsburg power and ambition, its Gothic towers rising above the Mur River Valley like stone fingers reaching toward heaven. Built in the 13th century and expanded by successive generations of Austrian dukes, the fortress had witnessed countless moments of triumph and tragedy in the long story of Habsburg ascendancy. Its walls enclosed chambers where emperors had been born, where marriage contracts had been negotiated that would reshape the map of Europe, and where the careful balance between temporal and spiritual authority that defined Catholic kingship was maintained through daily rituals of prayer, ceremony, and political calculation. The Habsburg family into which Margaret was born operated according to a philosophy that would seem almost incomprehensibly alien to modern sensibilities. Where other royal houses sought to expand their influence through conquest, trade, or diplomatic innovation, the Habsburgs had perfected what they called their marriage strategy, encapsulated in the Latin motto that had guided their rise to power for generations. Bella Jurant alii, to Felix Austria nube, meaning, let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. This approach had served them extraordinarily well, transforming a relatively minor Austrian ducal family into the preeminent dynasty of Europe, but it came with consequences that would prove increasingly catastrophic as the generations passed. The strategy had its origins in the pragmatic wisdom of earlier Habsburg rulers who recognized that military conquest, while spectacular when successful, carried enormous risks and costs that could destroy a dynasty as easily as elevate it. Marriage, by contrast, offered a more subtle but potentially more durable path to power, creating bonds of blood and obligation that could survive political upheavals and military defeats. A well-chosen marriage could bring not only territory and wealth, but also access to new networks of allies, trading partners, and information sources that would serve Habsburg interests for generations to come. Margaret's father, Archduke Charles, ruled over Inner Austria from his court in Graz, governing territories that included modern-day Slovenia, much of Croatia, and portions of northern Italy. He was known throughout the Habsburg domains as a man of deep Catholic piety, having played a crucial role in the Counter-Reformation's efforts to reclaim territories that had fallen to Protestant influence. His court was a center of Catholic learning and artistic patronage, where Jesuit scholars debated theology, with Italian architects and Flemish painters created works that celebrated both the glory of God and the power of the Habsburg dynasty. Into this environment of religious devotion, political calculation, and artistic refinement, Margaret was born as the third child and second daughter, her arrival marking her as valuable marriage material in the great game of European politics. The Archduke's commitment to the Counter-Reformation went far beyond mere political calculation, reflecting a genuine belief that the Habsburg dynasty had been chosen by divine providence to serve as the sword and shield of Catholic Christianity against the forces of heresy and unbelief. His territories had become a laboratory for the new forms of Catholic spirituality and artistic expression that emerged from the Council of Trent, with Jesuit colleges, Reformed monasteries, and magnificent Baroque churches serving as both centers of religious life and demonstrations of Catholic cultural superiority over Protestant alternatives. Her mother, Maria Anna of Bavaria, brought to the union not only her own noble bloodline, but also the fierce Catholic orthodoxy of the Bavarian Wittelsbachs, a family that had positioned itself as one of the leading forces in the Catholic Counter-Reformation. Maria Anna was known for her intelligence and political acumen, qualities that she would pass on to her daughter along with an understanding of how royal women could exercise power behind the scenes even in a world that formally relegated them to subordinate roles. The marriage between Charles and Maria Anna represented everything the Habsburg strategy sought to achieve: the joining of two powerful Catholic houses, the strengthening of religious orthodoxy against Protestant challenges, and the creation of children who would carry forward the dynasty's mission to rule over a unified Catholic Europe. Maria Anna's influence extended throughout the court at Graz, where she maintained an extensive correspondence with Catholic nobles and church officials across Europe, gathering intelligence about Protestant activities and coordinating responses to threats against Catholic interests. Her letters, preserved in various European archives, reveal a sophisticated understanding of the complex religious and political dynamics that shaped late 16th century Europe, as well as a fierce determination to ensure that her children would be raised with the knowledge and skills necessary to defend Catholic civilization against its enemies. Young Margaret's childhood unfolded against the backdrop of momentous changes sweeping across Europe. The Protestant Reformation, which had begun with Martin Luther's challenge to papal authority in 1517, continued to fragment the religious unity that had defined medieval Christendom. The Holy Roman Empire, over which Margaret's distant cousin Rudolph II presided from his court in Prague, was increasingly divided between Catholic and Protestant territories, with each side viewing the other not merely as political rivals, but as existential threats to salvation itself. Meanwhile, the Ottoman Empire under Sultan Murad III continued its centuries-long expansion into European territory, having conquered much of the Balkans and repeatedly threatened Vienna, the Habsburg capital that stood as the last major barrier between Turkish forces and the heart of Catholic Europe. The Ottoman threat was never merely theoretical for the Habsburg family, whose ancestors had fought against Turkish expansion for over 2 centuries. The very walls of Vienna bore scars from Ottoman siege artillery, while Hungarian nobles who had fled Turkish occupation filled the courts of Austria with tales of Islamic conquest and Christian suffering. Young Margaret grew up hearing stories of her great-uncle Ferdinand, who had died defending Hungarian territory against Ottoman invasion, and of the countless soldiers, priests, and civilians who had sacrificed their lives in the ongoing struggle to preserve Christian Europe against Muslim expansion. In this context of religious warfare and territorial competition, Margaret's education reflected the complex demands placed upon Habsburg princesses. She learned Latin and Italian alongside her native German, mastered the intricate protocols of court etiquette, and received instruction in music, dancing, and the visual arts that were considered essential accomplishments for a lady of her station. More importantly, she absorbed the political lessons that would serve her throughout her life: how to read the subtle signals of court intrigue, how to build networks of allies and information sources, and how to exercise influence through carefully chosen words and strategic silences rather than direct commands. Her tutors included some of the most learned men of the age, Jesuit scholars who brought to Graz the latest developments in theology, philosophy, and natural science from universities across Catholic Europe. These men understood that Margaret's education was not merely a matter of personal accomplishment, but a preparation for the day when she would need to represent Habsburg interests in a foreign court, perhaps serving as regent for minor children or advisor to a husband whose own education might be less comprehensive than her own. The young Archduchess also received a thorough grounding in Catholic theology and devotional practices, learning to see her future role not merely as a political alliance maker, but as an instrument of divine will in the struggle to preserve and extend Catholic Christianity. This religious education was far from merely ceremonial. The Counter-Reformation had made theological sophistication a practical necessity for Catholic rulers, who needed to understand complex doctrinal disputes and coordinate with church authorities in their efforts to combat Protestant influence. Margaret learned to navigate the intricate relationship between temporal and spiritual authority that defined Catholic kingship, understanding that her future husband would rule not merely by hereditary right, but as God's appointed representative on earth. Daily life at the court in Graz revolved around a carefully orchestrated schedule of religious observances, political meetings, and cultural activities that reinforced the Habsburg commitment to Catholic orthodoxy, while maintaining the family's position at the center of European politics. Margaret participated in elaborate liturgical ceremonies that celebrated the major festivals of the church year, attended diplomatic receptions where she observed the delicate negotiations that maintained peace between competing powers, and joined in artistic performances that demonstrated the cultural sophistication that distinguished the Habsburg court from the courts of lesser nobles. As Margaret approached adolescence, the question of her marriage became a matter of intense diplomatic calculation throughout the courts of Europe. The Habsburg marriage strategy required that each union serve multiple purposes, strengthening existing alliances, creating new ones, and producing children who would continue the dynasty's expansion across the continent. Various possibilities were considered and discarded as political circumstances shifted. A marriage to a French prince might help resolve the ongoing conflicts between the Habsburg and Valois dynasties, but it would also risk exposing Margaret to Protestant influence and potentially weakening Catholic unity. A union with an Italian nobleman could strengthen Habsburg control over their Italian territories, but it would do little to advance the family's broader European ambitions. The diplomatic correspondence surrounding Margaret's potential marriage reveals the extraordinary complexity of late 16th century European politics, with every proposed union requiring careful analysis of its implications for religious unity, territorial control, commercial relationships, and military alliances. Habsburg agents throughout Europe reported on the character, health, and political connections of potential bridegrooms, while foreign ambassadors sought to influence the decision in ways that would serve their own monarch's interests. The solution that emerged reflected both the opportunities and the dangers inherent in the Habsburg approach to dynastic politics. In 1598, when Margaret was barely 14 years old, negotiations were concluded for her marriage to Philip III of Spain, who had ascended to the Spanish throne just months earlier following the death of his father. Philip II, one of the most powerful and feared monarchs in European history. This union would make Margaret not merely a queen, but the ruler of the largest empire in human history, commanding territories that stretched from the Netherlands in northern Europe to the Philippines in the far Pacific, from the silver mines of Peru to the trading posts of the East Indies. Philip II's death had marked the end of an era in European politics, closing the chapter on a reign that had seen Spanish power reach its zenith, while also revealing the fundamental contradictions that would ultimately undermine Habsburg dominance. The late king had been simultaneously the most Catholic and the most feared ruler of his age, a man who had sent the Spanish Armada against Protestant England while also presiding over the golden age of Spanish literature and art. His legacy to his young son included not only vast territories and enormous wealth, but also a complex web of military commitments, financial obligations, and political enemies that would test the capabilities of any successor. The marriage represented the ultimate expression of the Habsburg commitment to keeping power within the family. Philip III was Margaret's cousin, the son of Philip II and Anna of Austria, who was herself the daughter of Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II. This meant that Margaret and her future husband shared not only the same great-grandfather, but also a complex web of blood relationships that had been accumulating for generations as the Habsburgs repeatedly intermarried with their own relatives. What the family saw as a preservation of bloodline purity, modern genetics would recognize as a dangerous concentration of recessive genes that would eventually produce devastating consequences for the dynasty's health and survival. The practice of cousin marriage had become so common among European royalty that it was rarely questioned, despite occasional observations about the physical and mental problems that seemed to plague certain royal families. The Habsburgs themselves had begun to show some signs of the genetic disorders that would eventually destroy the dynasty's ability to produce viable heirs. But these problems were typically attributed to divine displeasure or environmental factors rather than hereditary causes that no one yet understood. The wedding negotiations revealed the extraordinary complexity of early modern diplomacy, involving not merely the bride and groom, but representatives of the Spanish crown, the Austrian archdukes, the Holy Roman Emperor, and the papal court, all of whom had interests in the outcome. The marriage contract specified not only Margaret's dowry and the financial arrangements that would support her household, but also detailed provisions about religious observances, court protocols, and the political role she would play in Spanish governance. These negotiations took months to complete, with every detail scrutinized for its potential impact on the delicate balance of European power. The dowry negotiations alone required extensive discussions about the transfer of territories, the payment of cash settlements, and the provision of ongoing financial support that would maintain Margaret's status as a Habsburg princess even after she became Queen of Spain. The Austrian archdukes were determined to ensure that their daughter would have sufficient resources to maintain her own household and exercise independent political influence, while the Spanish negotiators sought to limit these financial commitments in order to preserve royal resources for other priorities. In April of 1599, Margaret departed from Graz for what would prove to be the last time, beginning a journey across Europe that would transform her from an Austrian archduchess into the Queen of Spain and Portugal. The wedding procession that carried her toward her destiny was itself a demonstration of Habsburg power and wealth, featuring hundreds of courtiers, servants, and guards, along with wagons loaded with the magnificent dowry that proclaimed her family's status and resources. As the procession wound its way through the Alpine passes and across the plains of northern Italy, it served as a moving advertisement for Habsburg grandeur, impressing local populations and foreign observers with the dynasty's ability to stage magnificent displays of wealth and power. The journey took several weeks to complete, with stops at major cities along the route where local authorities organized elaborate receptions to honor the future Queen of Spain. These ceremonies provided opportunities for Margaret to practice the public role she would soon assume, accepting the homage of local nobles and church officials while demonstrating the grace and dignity expected of a Habsburg princess. Foreign ambassadors used these occasions to observe the young archduchess and report their impressions to their respective courts, contributing to the complex intelligence networks that shaped European diplomatic relationships. The actual wedding ceremony took place in Valencia in April of 1599, conducted with all the pomp and circumstance befitting the union of two of Europe's most powerful ruling houses. Margaret, now 15 years old, found herself at the center of celebrations that lasted for days, featuring elaborate court entertainments, religious ceremonies, and public festivities designed to demonstrate the joy and prosperity that the royal marriage would supposedly bring to Spain and its vast empire. The young queen was presented to her new subjects as a symbol of Habsburg continuity and Catholic orthodoxy, a living embodiment of the dynasty's commitment to preserving the faith and extending Spanish power throughout the world. The wedding festivities included theatrical performances, musical concerts, bullfights, and elaborate banquets that showcased the wealth and sophistication of the Spanish court, while also demonstrating the cultural unity that supposedly bound together the diverse territories of the Spanish Empire. Artists and writers from across Europe contributed to these celebrations, creating works that praised the royal couple and predicted a glorious future for their reign. What Margaret discovered upon her arrival in Spain, however, was an empire in the midst of a profound crisis that would define the remainder of her life and reign. The Spanish monarchy that she had married into was certainly the most extensive in human history, controlling territories on every inhabited continent and commanding resources that dwarfed those of any other European power. Spanish silver from the mines of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia had flooded European markets for decades, financing not only Spanish military campaigns, but also transforming the entire European economy through unprecedented inflation. Spanish fleets dominated the world's oceans, carrying goods and wealth from Asia to Europe, and from the Americas to Spain in quantities that earlier generations could never have imagined. The flow of American silver had created what economists would later recognize as the first global economy, with Spanish coins serving as international currency from Manila to Amsterdam and from Mexico City to Vienna. This unprecedented wealth had allowed Spain to maintain military forces on a scale never before seen in European history, with Spanish armies fighting simultaneously in the Netherlands, Italy, North Africa, and the Americas, while Spanish fleets patrolled sea lanes from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean. Yet this apparent prosperity concealed fundamental weaknesses that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The constant flow of American silver had created a dangerous dependency on colonial resources while undermining domestic Spanish industry and agriculture. Spanish craftsmen found it difficult to compete with foreign goods purchased with American gold, leading to a decline in manufacturing that would have devastating long-term consequences for the kingdom's economic independence. Meanwhile, the enormous costs of maintaining garrisons, fleets, and administrative systems across such a vast empire were consuming resources faster than even the legendary wealth of the Indies could replenish them. The economic problems were compounded by demographic challenges that threatened the very foundations of Spanish power. The population of Castile, the core kingdom that provided the administrative and military backbone of the empire, had been declining for decades due to emigration to the colonies, military casualties, and periodic outbreaks of plague and other diseases. Rural areas were particularly affected, with entire villages abandoned as their inhabitants sought opportunities in colonial territories or died in foreign wars. The military situation was equally troubling. Spain remained locked in a seemingly endless conflict with the Dutch rebels who had been fighting for independence since the 1560s, a war that had already consumed enormous amounts of money and manpower with no resolution in sight. The Dutch, supported by English and French assistance, had proven remarkably effective at defending their territory while simultaneously building a global trading network that directly challenged Spanish commercial dominance. In the Mediterranean, Spanish forces continued to confront Ottoman expansion while also dealing with persistent piracy that disrupted trade and threatened coastal populations throughout the region. The Dutch revolt had evolved from a localized rebellion against Spanish taxation and religious policies into a broader challenge to Spanish hegemony in northern Europe. The rebels had developed innovative military tactics, financial instruments, and diplomatic strategies that allowed them to compete effectively with Spanish power, despite their much smaller population and territory. Their success had inspired other potential rebels throughout the Spanish Empire, while also demonstrating to European observers that Spanish military dominance was not invincible. Perhaps most significantly for Margaret's future role, the Spanish court itself was plagued by factional disputes, administrative inefficiency, and a decision-making process that seemed increasingly incapable of responding effectively to the empire's mounting challenges. Philip III, Margaret's new husband, had inherited not only his father's vast territories, but also his indecisive temperament and tendency to rely heavily on court favorites rather than developing coherent long-term policies. The young king was known to be intelligent and well-educated, but he lacked the forceful personality and clear vision that had characterized his grandfather, Charles V, during Spain's period of greatest expansion and success. The Spanish administrative system had grown increasingly complex and unwieldy as the empire expanded, with overlapping jurisdictions, competing authorities, and bureaucratic procedures that often prevented effective action, even when the need for decisive leadership was obvious. Regional administrators throughout the empire complained about conflicting orders from different government departments, while colonial officials struggled to implement policies that had been designed without adequate understanding of local conditions. Into this environment of imperial overstretch and political dysfunction, Margaret brought not only her Habsburg bloodline and Catholic devotion, but also the political skills and strategic thinking that she had absorbed during her upbringing in Graz. Unlike many royal brides who found themselves isolated and powerless in foreign courts, Margaret quickly established herself as a significant influence on Spanish policy making, working behind the scenes to coordinate between different factions and interest groups, while gradually building her own network of allies and information sources throughout the vast Spanish bureaucracy. Her approach to court politics reflected the sophisticated understanding of power dynamics that she had learned from observing her parents' management of the complex political situation in Inner Austria. Margaret understood that effective leadership in such an environment required not dramatic gestures or public confrontations, but patient relationship building, careful information gathering, and the ability to find compromise solutions that allowed all parties to preserve their dignity while advancing common interests. The young queen's influence became particularly apparent in religious and cultural matters, where her deep Catholic piety and understanding of Reformation theology made her a valuable ally for church officials seeking to strengthen Orthodox Catholic practices throughout the Spanish dominions. Margaret supported the expansion of Jesuit educational institutions, patronized artists and writers whose works celebrated Catholic themes, and worked to ensure that colonial administrators in the Americas and Asia maintained strict adherence to Catholic doctrine in their governance of indigenous populations. Her court became a center for Catholic intellectual life, attracting scholars, theologians, and missionaries who saw her as a patron and protector of their efforts to defend and extend the faith. The Queen's religious patronage extended beyond mere ceremonial support to include active involvement in theological discussions and missionary planning that shaped Spanish colonial policy throughout her reign. She maintained correspondence with Jesuit missionaries in China and the Philippines, Dominican friars in the Americas, and Franciscan scholars in Europe, creating an informal network of religious advisors who provided her with detailed information about conditions throughout the Spanish Empire and opportunities for advancing Catholic interests. Margaret's political influence extended far beyond religious matters, however. She quickly mastered the complex dynamics of Spanish court politics, learning to navigate the competing interests of different noble families, regional authorities, and administrative departments that often seemed more concerned with advancing their own agendas than with serving the broader interests of the monarchy. The Queen developed a reputation for careful listening, thoughtful analysis, and the ability to find compromise solutions to seemingly intractable disputes. Foreign ambassadors and Spanish officials alike came to recognize that gaining Margaret's support was often more valuable than securing formal approval from the king himself, since her recommendations carried enormous weight in the final decision-making process. Her political methodology involved the creation of informal consultation networks that bypassed the rigid hierarchies of the official Spanish administrative system. Margaret would gather information from multiple sources, including court ladies who maintained connections with provincial nobility, merchants who traveled throughout the empire, and church officials who observed conditions in distant territories. This intelligence-gathering system allowed her to develop a comprehensive understanding of imperial conditions that often exceeded that of formal government departments. The early years of Margaret's reign as Queen of Spain coincided with a series of military and diplomatic challenges that tested both her political skills and her husband's capacity for leadership. The ongoing war in the Netherlands continued to drain Spanish resources while producing few tangible results, leading to growing pressure within the court for either a decisive military escalation or a negotiated settlement that would allow Spain to redirect its energies toward other priorities. Meanwhile, relations with France remained tense despite periodic attempts at diplomatic reconciliation. While the English continued to support Dutch independence and challenge Spanish control over Atlantic trade routes, the complexity of these interconnected conflicts required a level of strategic thinking and diplomatic coordination that exceeded the capabilities of the traditional Spanish administrative system. Margaret's role in developing Spanish responses to these challenges reflected both her personal abilities and the unique position that her Habsburg background gave her within the broader European political system. In this context, Margaret's role as queen consort took on dimensions that extended far beyond the ceremonial functions typically associated with royal wives. She became, in effect, a crucial component of the Spanish decision-making apparatus, providing continuity and institutional memory as various ministers and advisors rose and fell in the king's favor. Her Habsburg background gave her unique insights into the broader European political landscape, while her growing understanding of Spanish colonial administration made her an invaluable resource for policy discussions about imperial governance and resource allocation. The Queen's influence was particularly evident in the realm of marriage diplomacy, where her expertise in Habsburg family politics proved essential for advancing Spanish interests through strategic unions. Margaret understood better than most Spanish officials how the complex web of European royal relationships could be manipulated to create new alliances, neutralize potential threats, and advance Spanish objectives without resorting to expensive military campaigns. Her recommendations shaped Spanish policy toward potential marriage partners for various Habsburg relatives, helping to ensure that these unions would serve Spanish interests while maintaining the broader Habsburg commitment to Catholic orthodoxy and dynastic continuity. As Margaret settled into her role as Queen of Spain, she also began the process that would define much of her historical legacy: the production of heirs who would continue the Habsburg dynasty and potentially inherit the vast Spanish Empire. The question of royal succession was never merely personal for monarchs of this era. It represented a matter of state that could determine the fate of millions of subjects and the balance of power throughout Europe. Margaret's ability to produce healthy male heirs would be seen as a measure of divine favor toward the Spanish monarchy, while any difficulties in this regard would inevitably be interpreted as signs of God's displeasure with Spanish policies or personal conduct. The pressure surrounding royal childbearing in this period was enormous, with court physicians, astrologers, theologians, and foreign ambassadors all monitoring the Queen's health and fertility as indicators of political stability and divine approval. Margaret's pregnancies became matters of international significance, with the birth of each child potentially altering the balance of European power and the prospects for Catholic unity against Protestant challenges. The Queen's first pregnancy, announced in late 1599, was greeted with celebrations throughout the Spanish dominions as evidence that the royal marriage was blessed by divine providence and that the Habsburg dynasty would continue its rule over the world's largest empire. Court physicians, astrologers, and theologians all offered their expertise in ensuring that the pregnancy would proceed smoothly and produce a healthy heir, while Spanish administrators in distant colonies organized prayers and festivities to demonstrate their loyalty to the royal family and their confidence in the monarchy's future. Margaret's approach to motherhood reflected the same careful balance between personal devotion and political calculation that characterized her entire reign as queen. She understood that her children would be not merely her own offspring, but also valuable assets in the great game of European diplomacy, potential marriage partners who could be used to strengthen existing alliances or create new ones as political circumstances required. At the same time, her deep Catholic faith led her to see motherhood as a sacred calling, a responsibility to raise future rulers who would govern according to Christian principles and continue the Habsburg mission to defend and extend Catholic civilization throughout the world. The birth of Margaret's first child, Maria Anna, in September of 1600, provided the Spanish court with both celebration and disappointment. While the arrival of a healthy princess was certainly cause for joy and demonstrated that the Queen was capable of successful childbearing, the Spanish succession required male heirs who could inherit the throne and continue the dynasty's rule. The complex inheritance laws that governed the Spanish monarchy meant that while women could inherit in the absence of male heirs, their reigns were generally seen as temporary arrangements that should be resolved through marriage to appropriate male relatives as quickly as possible. Margaret's subsequent pregnancies and births established her as one of the most prolific royal mothers of her era, ultimately producing 8 children who survived to adulthood and played crucial roles in European politics throughout the first half of the 17th century. Each birth was accompanied by elaborate court ceremonies, public celebrations, and diplomatic communications to foreign courts announcing the expansion of the Habsburg family and the strengthening of Spanish dynastic claims. The Queen's success in producing numerous healthy children was interpreted throughout Catholic Europe as evidence of divine approval for the Spanish monarchy and its policies, while Protestant opponents of Habsburg power viewed the growing family as a threat to the religious and political balance that had emerged from the Reformation conflicts. The most significant of Margaret's children, from the perspective of Spanish succession, was the future Philip IV. Born in April of 1605 after several years during which the Queen had produced only daughters. The birth of a male heir was greeted with unprecedented celebrations throughout the Spanish Empire, featuring public festivals, religious ceremonies, and artistic commissions that proclaimed the continuation of Habsburg rule and the divine blessing that this represented for Spanish power and Catholic orthodoxy. The young prince's birth also marked a crucial turning point in Margaret's own political influence, establishing her not merely as the king's wife, but as the mother of Spain's future ruler, and therefore a figure whose opinions and preferences would need to be carefully considered by anyone seeking to advance their interests within the Spanish court system. The celebrations surrounding Prince Philip's birth reflected the enormous relief felt throughout the Spanish Empire at the resolution of succession anxieties that had plagued the monarchy since Margaret's marriage. The future king's arrival ensured that Spanish power would continue under Habsburg leadership for at least another generation, providing stability and continuity that allowed long-term planning and policy development in ways that had been impossible when the succession remained uncertain.